All right, welcome everyone to the Yogic Studies podcast. I'm your host, Seth Powell. This is episode 36, and today we are joined by Philip Deslippe. Philip is a historian of yoga and American religion. He's a PhD candidate at the University of California at Santa Barbara. Welcome back to the Yogic Studies podcast, to Yogic Studies in general, Philip. It's great to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Seth. It's great to be back.
Yeah, so Philip, as many of you will know, he taught a course for us back in 2019, back when Yogic Studies was still just getting started, actually. Philip was our first instructor, other than myself, that we were able to bring on to the platform and beginning to grow into what we now are today. And he was on the podcast back in 2020, episode 4. Mm-hmm. So do go back and listen to that episode. In episode 4, we go into much more details, I think, about Philip's past, his background and training in grad school. And we go into a lot of detail there about his research on Yogi Bhajan and the Kundalini yoga community and controversies and abuse of power and everything that's kind of going on with Kundalini yoga. That episode, actually, Philip, I was looking back at the analytics here before our show here today, and that remains in the top 3 of our episodes. Most downloaded episodes. So there's been, I think, unsurprisingly, a lot of interest because of the importance of that conversation, and then also, your research and your voice in that discourse. So we won't be touching on any of that today because we've dealt with that in great detail. But today I'm really excited to talk about your revised Modern Yoga in the West course that you'll be teaching at Yogic Studies, and to really dive into your dissertation research. I think we had meant to get to that in that previous podcast, and then we had so much other things to talk about. We really needed to do a whole part 2. So here we are. So I'm excited to have you here and have a lot of time and space to just enter into this research on what you've called early American yoga. So maybe just to get things started, when we talk about modern yoga, the history of yoga in the West, if you read, whether it's a book or if you even, listen to a lecture on the history of yoga in the West, typically it starts with someone like Swami Vivekananda, in the 1890s and the World Parliament of Religions. Maybe Paramahansa Yogananda coming from India to the West. Some of these really big gurus, big name figures from India coming to the West, doing some teaching. And then there tends to be this big gap, after the, late 1800s, that late 19th century. And then we have sort of this guru wave in the 1960s and the counterculture, and then this sort of postural yoga boom in the West. But I think your research really helps to fill in this gap in between, but also to look into much more detail to that first wave of yoga in the Americas in the late 1800s. You focus on lesser known figures, highlighting and giving primacy to their stories and to their lives. Is that an apt kind of characterization? Or tell us a little bit just kind of about your project and how you got into it.
Yeah, so I often like to say that one of the defining features of the early history of yoga in the United States is that it is about a type. It is about a group of people, dozens and dozens of people in the United States who are doing the same thing. And in fact, they're a network. They're learning from each other. They're often directly helping each other. Ironically, my process to get to that conclusion that it's not about individuals came through really digging into the specifics of individual lives over dozens and dozens of times. So what I did for this kind of larger research project was really obsessively dig into the details. I tracked down yoga as it appeared in the United States, wherever I found it. The main source of data that I've used were display advertisements. Mm. So I started going through historical newspaper databases and just searching for yoga. Where does yoga show up in the 19-teens and the 1920s? And I started seeing display advertisements from various yoga teachers. So one of the big things that I did was I started taking these display advertisements and coding them out, taking the information from each and putting it onto an Excel spreadsheet. So just a simple display advertisement. We have a name, we have a venue, we have a city, we have a date, we have lecture topics. And so I started coding all of those out. And at this point, I think I've coded out 6,500 classes and lectures, something like that. I took a cue from the late Professor Gerald Larson, who kind of said offhandedly, every morning I wake up and I have coffee and I do 2 hours of Sanskrit. I'm not that dedicated, but I make it a point at least once a week to take time and to continue to dig up display advertisements and code them out just to keep that going.
And so you're still finding more material, you're still continuing to dig up.
Yeah, more and more. There's kind of a big ocean of records left behind at that level.
And are most of these posters and advertisements, are they digitized and part of online collections that you're searching through, or have you had to travel and go, kind of more old school and go in person and visit these libraries and archives?
It's been a combination of both. So one of the things about these online databases is that they're very extensive, but they have their limits. There are certain cities and there are certain newspapers that aren't covered. Due to copyright, there are certain databases that they go up until 1923 or 1925, and then they stop. But there are also plenty of physical archives that have bits and pieces. So I've done research at libraries and at university archives in the United States, in the UK, and I think most important have been the private archives that family members hold. So I've tracked down the relatives and descendants and some of the students of these early American yoga teachers. I've probably interviewed over a dozen of them, and many of them have their own personal family archives, scrapbooks and collections of materials and photographs, and also significantly the stories that they heard and that they remember about their father, their grandfather, or their teacher or their teacher's teacher. So there isn't a single archive of this period of time in yoga's history in the way that you could maybe go to a Catholic diocese or a university archive and see a denomination's history in one place. But it's really been a matter of kind of doing a circuit myself, of going through archives, physical and digital, and putting pieces together. And then that gives you more insight to keep going around and adding to that and adding to the understanding of that time and place.
So what time period are we talking about here?
Yoga is in the United States in various forms, depending on how you want to define it, in the early 1800s, 1805, 1806, 1810. We have stage magicians who are using yogic persona. They are claiming to be a fakir or a Hindu wonder worker. So if we see yoga in that kind of wide lens really early on, this really picks up steam in the 1860s and the 1870s. I just finished a book chapter that talks about how only a few years after the American Civil War in 1867, 1868, the word fakir starts to be used in a very popular way in the United States. It's a word for sidewalk merchants. These guys who go and they set up shop on a street corner, and they're loud and they use all these tricks, and they draw attention to themselves to sell kind of cheap items. There are people who are lecturing on yoga in the United States well before Swami Vivekananda. He, in fact, is not the first South Asian to lecture explicitly on yoga on American soil. That happened several years before his arrival in 1893. And then there's this kind of first wave of lecturers and yoga teachers, starting around the time of Swami Vivekananda for about another 30 years. And they kind of are of a type. Often they come over for these large gatherings or conventions like Vivekananda did. They're seen as lecturers. They're usually supported by a small handful of affluent devotees. But there's this huge change in 1923. And I think this change happens in three ways. The Vedanta Society, set up by Swami Vivekananda, they have a few kind of forward-thinking swamis in the United States who make the decision that they should have more teachers come over. So in 1923, we start to have this wave of newer, younger, energetic swamis from the Vedanta Society who start establishing new branches, who start kind of traveling around. And because they're young and energetic, they are here for decades, and they really kind of raise the profile of yoga and Hinduism among their followers. The second thing that happens is Swami Yogananda, who in some ways is kind of representative of this first wave of teachers. He was primarily based out of Boston. And in 1923, he starts traveling around the country.
This is Paramahansa Yogananda?
Yeah, I'm a little bit reluctant. I know too much to use the honorific title, but yes,
Author
the same Yogananda.
Author of Autobiography of a Yogi.
Kind of, not exactly, but we can get into that later.
We'll get to that.
He starts traveling around the country, and he falls in love with property in Southern California.
Mm-hmm.
And so he not only travels around the country, but he starts bringing in affiliates who will help spread his teachings and have regional kind of territories for his nascent organization. So that raises the profile of yoga in the United States. And the third, and I would say the largest factor, is a Supreme Court decision in 1923 that rules that South Asians are not white and ineligible for American citizenship. And so this has several major consequences. If you're South Asian in the United States, you're suddenly without the rights and abilities of an American citizen. You can't own property. You can't own farmland. You cannot marry an American citizen without her risking the loss of her own citizenship, in addition to all sorts of informal prejudices. Even more dramatic, for about 70 South Asian Americans who had already gained citizenship, they lost their American citizenship in a wave of denaturalization proceedings. So these are, as some newspapers describe them, men without a country. They have no citizenship, no passport. They can't leave the United States and have any hope of being accepted or coming back, any guarantee of that. So what dozens of them do is they reinvent themselves. They make themselves into yogis and swamis and metaphysical lecturers. And instead of staying put and investing in a headquarters or a base of operations in a city, they take the show on the road and they travel around the country. And in going through all these display advertisements and ephemera and talking to descendants and family members, you see that this is the model for the teaching of yoga, going from one city to the next, sometimes for as little as a week, sometimes for several months. And these teachers would advertise themselves and announce their presence through a series of free lectures open to the public. Mm-hmm. And often these were accentuated with musical performances and demonstrations and question and answer sessions. A few of them would have healing vibrations that were offered to the audience. And you can't make a living off of free lectures. So what they would then do is those free lectures would then lead into smaller private courses of instruction for a fee. So you're moving from maybe several hundred people at a free lecture to several dozen in a smaller private course. And some of them would then do one-on-one dyadic services for their students and followers. And this could be anything from what we would see as counseling and life coaching to psychic readings, astrological charts, healing services. And that was the model. And at first I thought, like, well, this is a coincidence that they're all following the model. But when you dig deeper into what's there, you realize that they all knew of each other, and in many cases directly knew each other. And there was often an indirect exchange of ideas. Someone would see advertisements and steal a title or steal a phrase. But very often they directly knew each other, and they would often help each other and exchange mailing lists and exchange advice.
So is this what you've dubbed the Swami Circuit?
Yeah, this is what I dubbed the Swami Circuit. I kind of offhandedly said that they were traveling like Methodist ministers who used to travel on a circuit. And that's how the Methodist Church extended its reach into the territories in the United States, is they would have ministers that would travel from little town and village and revisit them once a month or every few months. And this, in fact, seemed to be what these early yoga teachers would do. They would often revisit cities once or twice a year in return.
So you mentioned at the outset that your research, although you've gone into the details and individual lives of each of these teachers and their stories and their biographies, and in some cases even interviewing their family members or whatever you can find, the individual stories have led you to these larger cultural and kind of systematic assessments of this circuit and these kind of networks of teaching, as you described, from one hotel to the next. Mm-hmm. And yet I imagine each individual teacher does have their own story to tell, their own biographies and nuances that they're adding to the story of yoga.
Yeah.
You mentioned that some of them, through these different legal processes and immigration law, faced different hardships and loss of citizenship, and were reinventing themselves in certain ways. I wonder if, we're kind of now making these general assessments about these figures. So maybe you could tell us, one or two case studies or stories, who are these people that we're talking about? Give us maybe an example if you don't mind.
Yeah. Happy to give a few examples. So I think it's this balance where you have these larger forces and you have this type of teacher, but you also have, obviously, you have individual differences. And to use an awful phrase, the ideas of yoga were very flexible at this time. There was not a clear and solid consensus in the United States in the 20s and 30s as to what exactly yoga was. There are certainly ideas, correct and fantastic, but it wasn't kind of set as it is today. I often like to say that when you see how different schools of yoga in the present moment differentiate themselves from each other, it really points to how similar yogic practice is from one studio to the next. The fact that we play this music and not that, we heat the room, we don't, we correct postures in this way and not that. The bigger picture is behind that. In various yoga classes, people are doing basically the same kind of things, the same postures, the same techniques with variations. This wasn't true 100 years ago. What yoga was very much an open question. And there really wasn't, I think, interestingly enough, there weren't really questions and debates over whether one thing was yoga or not. Yoga was seen as philosophy, as psychology, as breathing, as diet reform, as magic, as hypnotism, um, all of these different things. And so this gave a lot of possibilities for these dozens of South Asian American men to reinvent themselves as yoga teachers. And you see many of them playing to their strengths, and using what they already know and what they're good at to create the teachings that they then offer to the public. So one figure was San Singh. He's a strapping Punjabi farm boy who does a lot of wrestling and the kind of folk style of rugby that's common in northern India, kabaddi. So his yogic teachings rely on a lot of breath control and a lot of demonstrations of strength and a lot of kind of physical culture. Someone like Bhagat Singh Thind, who is very intellectual, very cerebral, when he comes to a city, he offers an endless series of lectures. He can, hold forth on philosophy and comparative religion. But they're also adapting as they are encountering students, as they are traveling across the country. They are seeing what works, what their students want, what their students don't want. And there's this very interesting dance where they are presenting themselves as different from their students outside of the lives of their students, but also making themselves understandable and familiar and appealing to the wants and desires of those students. I think one of my favorite examples of a yoga teacher during this time was Rishi Singh Gurwal. He's both very unique, but aspects of his life and his teachings really touch on a lot of his colleagues and contemporaries. So Rishi Singh Gurwal leaves India, like many others, because he was agitating for Indian independence from the British. And so that puts his life in danger. So he comes to the United States and he studied yoga in India and he starts to teach yoga in the United States. And he is one of the very first, perhaps the first person to teach yoga as we understand it today in the United States to a popular audience. He is getting copies of Swami Kaivalyananda's Yoga Mimamsa and kind of copying and repackaging it. And he is offering postures and pranayam to his audience in the United States. He loses citizenship like so many others in 1923. So he has that in common, but he has a very unique, singular answer to this. So he tries to get his citizenship back. His appeals don't work. And so when he's teaching on the Swami Circuit in Washington, D.C., he spends his evenings lecturing on yoga in a local hotel. And then during the day, he just shows up in the Senate and in the Congress. And he approaches various lawmakers, tells them about his story, and he gets a one-person law passed by the Senate. And you can see it in the items. There's a law that just allows him to appeal his citizenship case at a federal district court.
Wow.
And he does. And he gets his citizenship back. And immediately, once he has his citizenship and the guarantee that he can return, he goes to India and he brings one of his students. And that becomes the basis of one of his books. And then when he returns, he has decades more of teaching. He eventually settles in the foothills of Santa Barbara. Some of his students end up teaching yoga in the 60s and 70s to hippie students at UC Santa Barbara, and the retreat center that he founded still exists today. So this early chapter of yoga in the United States, it's interesting history. It's an interesting kind of prelude to what comes after it. But in many ways, it's a history that still has life in it. It still has connections to people today.
Yeah, his is a fascinating story. But so I'm wondering, how many of these teachers like Gerwal had connections to India or to an Indian yoga guru or lineage, an Indian yoga tradition, versus how many of them just sort of found themselves in the United States as sort of a South Asian without a home, as you said, and sort of refashioning themselves based maybe on books or based on whatever materials on yoga and meditation and Hinduism that they could find at the time. How many of them were actually in some ways yogis or
Hmm.
yoga practitioners or teachers sort of already to begin with,
Hmm.
and how that might matter or not, in their public teaching, the way that they maybe portray themselves,
Hmm.
in connection to some perhaps supposed ancient tradition. Today there's so much concern and anxiety about authenticity,
Hmm.
and lineage and the history, that's often been challenged in recent years. Some of the scholarship, in fact, has challenged some of these narratives about histories of lineages. But I'm curious at this time how these teachers were presenting themselves, and fact or fiction, how much of them, were actually, you mentioned Gerwal went back to India, kind of in some ways got recharged with his yoga in some
Hmm.
capacity, and then kind of refueled, came back and found his niche in Santa Barbara. So,
Hmm.
anyways, anything you can kind of share about these questions?
Well, I think that concern about authenticity and lineage in a different yet very similar way, that's still around in the 1920s and 1930s. And you'd be hard pressed to find a yoga teacher on the Swami Circuit who is not claiming some sort of lineage, some sort of master in the Himalayas. Um, but very few, if any, had that kind of direct connection. I think Graywall was unique in that he was teaching yoga as we know it and trying to be rather precise. Um, he published translations of uh, older yogic texts. He's kind of following the lead of Swami Kulvalyananda. I think his teachings of yoga, more than anyone else, are comprehensible to people today. Um, but authenticity is a very tricky question because that's an immediate question that comes up for many people when I talk about my work. A lot of people want to make the leap and say, so they were fakers. They were making it up, which is true, but also I think not the entire truth.
Mm.
Um, I think something that's very relevant today is that um, authenticity and lineage, um, in many ways, they could kind of be judged very pragmatically. They exist, but also, is it more important what good or harm they do in the world? Today we have many examples of teachers who are in established lineages who do a lot of harm through the abuse of power, including the power that comes from being within an established lineage. And at the same time, I don't think we can say that even practices that are made up um, are without benefit to their students or practitioners. So one interview I did, which was amazing, was of two grandchildren who their grandmother and their grand aunt were both direct students of a yoga teacher that I wrote about, Yogi Hari Rama. So Yogi Hari Rama comes to the United States in 1906. He works as a butler in Chicago, and then he learns to fly. He's a student at one of the first aviation schools in the United States. He becomes the first person from India to become a licensed pilot. And he has this short career as a stunt pilot. He goes to Europe with a famous aviation magnate. He goes back to the US. He lives in Los Angeles. He works as a chauffeur. He makes a very poor decision investing his money. And so he loses his fortune. And then in 1923, he loses his citizenship, one right after the other.
Mm.
So, like so many others, he reinvents himself as a yoga teacher. And when you dig into what he's teaching, he's just shoplifting stuff left and right. He's stealing diagrams from Yogi Wasan. He is stealing aphorisms and philosophy from his predecessor 20 years earlier, Swami Ramtirtha. He's stealing exercises from Yogananda. There's this angry letter from one of Yogananda's administrators who says, basically, this dude signed up for a course and now he's just reusing it across the country and charging people money for it. It's very easy to see him as a faker. Yogi Harirama goes on a single 3.5-year tour of the United States, and he collects a huge amount of money, and then he just disappears. One newspaper reporter kind of ironically said, yeah, Yogi Harirama's advertisements, he says he visits a city but once. Yeah, that makes sense. Who would want to return, to the scene of a crime after doing this?
Wow.
So I tracked down a brother and sister whose grandmother and great aunt were direct students of Yogi Harirama. And in their discussions, they were both yoga teachers, and they were inspired to do yoga through their grandmother and great aunt. And they remember those two faithfully adhering to Yogi Harirama's teachings for the rest of their lives, decades and decades after they met him. They remember the portrait of Yogi Harirama in their homes. They were lifelong vegetarians. They would do this kind of visualization meditation exercise where they would lay down and send energy to different points of the body. And by all accounts, they led very happy lives. They were very kind of sweet, peaceful people who found a lot of meaning through Yogi Harirama and his teachings. So, I think it goes both ways. It's not a simple question.
It reminds me of the recent film Kumare with, I think it's Vikram Gandhi.
Gandhi,
he takes on the guise as a Swami, as a yoga teacher, and essentially makes up a series of teachings and a narrative about some fake South Asian country, I think, where he's from, and goes somewhere, maybe Arizona or Utah or somewhere, and finds a community and gains a following of students. I think there's a yoga studio owner who hosts him and puts a lot of stock in him as her guru and promotes his teachings to her students. And in the end, it's revealed that he made the whole thing up. And some of the students, and especially that studio owner and teacher, are furious because they feel like they've been duped. They've invested their trust and faith in this teacher. And I think there was other students who felt like they actually still got something spiritually out of his teachings, that they were actually efficacious in some way. And so it raises all sorts of interesting questions about, the context in which we're doing things, and the intentionality and authenticity and all of that. But I imagine, for these teachers in the Swami Circuit, there was probably, a wide range of background and intentionality, and this phrase authenticity is not so black and white, right?
Yeah.
Authenticity is sort of is always in the process of being fashioned and refashioned depending on these contexts and histories.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that they're teaching at hotels. So I wanted to ask you about that. Today when we think of the practice of yoga and yoga teaching, we kind of, imagine the modern yoga studio, but that perhaps didn't really exist yet at this time of, in the early 1900s, or not quite in the same way. Why hotels, and what do you think that did for kind of yoga in the public?
I think yoga in the 20s and 30s absolutely depended on hotels for a variety of reasons. That was one of the things that jumped out at me when I started bringing together that spreadsheet of doom and seeing, where these teachers are teaching at. Yoga was taught in hotels more than every other type of venue combined. So yoga teachers would teach at kind of fraternal lodges, Freemasons, Elks, Odd Fellows halls. They would occasionally teach at churches. Many of them taught at women's clubs. So this was kind of a thing in the time of middle class, upper middle class women would have social clubs, and they would have lecturers and teachers come. But overwhelmingly, it's hotels. And this happens for several reasons. The first is hotels are modular. So in hotels during this time, you have meeting halls and banquet halls. You have these smaller rooms that are called demonstration rooms. So when traveling salesmen would travel around, you're not going to bring all of your merchandise. You're going to bring samples of your merchandise. And when you want to meet with different shop owners, you want to bring them to a room where you have everything set up. So there are these smaller rooms called demonstration rooms where salesmen would demonstrate their product to potential buyers. And hotels also have suites. You have a place where you can stay, but with a suite, you have this kind of neutral, respectable room where you can entertain people and meet with people. And so these types of rooms line up perfectly with the different levels of instruction and interaction that these teachers have. You have a large meeting room or ballroom where you can have your large public lecture of several hundred people. You have demonstration rooms where you can have 10 or 20 or 30 people. And then you have a suite. So if you're doing these one-on-one dyadic encounters, you can do that as well. And unlike the previous model where Swamis like Baba Bharati and Vivekananda and Abhedananda, they were dependent on patrons, not just financially, but for being hosted, having lodging. The hotel frees up teachers from that kind of dependence on a patron. If you go to a hotel, you have rooms of the various sizes that you need, and you have a place to stay, and you have all these services that hotels offer to travelers. There were many incidents of yoga teachers trying to teach at a church or at a high school and falling out of favor with people in the town or people in charge of the venue. So Yogi Wasan has a series of classes canceled from a public high school. There's a Swami in the Vedanta Society who's going to give a lecture at a church, and it creates this huge uproar, and that's canceled. Hotels are democratic in a very kind of money-driven way. If you can pay your bill and you're not violating the law, hotels will host you. And they hosted a variety of civic organizations and different groups just as easily as they hosted yoga teachers. And this allows a yoga teacher to operate with minimal infrastructure. You're not paying rent on a building. You're just traveling from place to place. I actually did a study of what the finances would have been like. And the cost of renting rooms at a hotel, staying at a hotel, versus what they would charge students to attend these private classes, there's pretty minimal overhead. You didn't have to be wildly successful to be successful. If you had as little as 15 students taking your private classes in any given city, you could do very well for yourself. And many of these teachers on the Swami Circuit, they had annual salaries that were comparable to like someone with a good office job. But it also goes the other way. So the dependence on hotels, it allows yoga to spread throughout the country. And that's why you see yoga all over the place, with the exception of the South. Hotels in parts of the country that are under Jim Crow, they restrict access to people that they understand to be Black. And America at this time doesn't really know what to do with people from South Asia. That's kind of behind the Supreme Court decision that takes away citizenship. There's no consensus on where do Indians fit in America's racial structure. Are they Black? Are they white? Are they not white? Are they not Black but not white? And so many yoga teachers who try to teach in the South have bad experiences, especially in hotels. Swami Vivekananda was denied access to 3 different hotels in Baltimore because the owner didn't want people to think that he was letting a Black man stay there. Something similar happens to Yogi Hari Rama in Texas. He's allowed to stay at a hotel on the condition that he keeps his turban and robes on at all times,
Hmm.
so that the various guests of the hotel are reassured he's Indian, he's Hindu, he's not black. So it kind of cuts both ways, and it really speaks to the unusual position that these yoga teachers are in. They have all of this allure and a certain type of power by being seen as these mystic masters and representatives of a spiritual East. At the same time, their connections with India work against them, and they are often criticized or harassed for being from India. And also the way that they fit into America's racial structure means that they're disenfranchised in very real ways, both in terms of citizenship and the way that they can move around the country and operate.
I want to pull up this map here
Mhm.
from your 2018 article, the
Mhm.
Swami Circuit from the Journal of Yoga Studies.
Mhm.
I think this, for those of you watching this on YouTube, you can see, if you're just listening, what we're looking at here is a map that Philip has plotted out based on the data that he's collected from the archives, a map of the United States. Tell us a little bit, more about this map and what's behind it, and what's seen and unseen, perhaps, on this map.
Okay, so when this map was drawn up, it was based on about 2,000 yoga lectures and classes. So now that I have more than 3 times that amount of data, the map is still representative. There are a little more small dots scattered throughout, but the general pattern is still true. When you ask people where they imagine yoga was taught in the 1920s, the quick answers are, well, big cities: Chicago, New York, Los Angeles.
The coasts.
Mark Singleton in Yoga Body, he looked at some of this data, and he described several teachers as West Coast gurus, West Coast yogis, because he saw display advertisements in California and in the Pacific Northwest. But when you really look at a massive set of data, you realize that with the exception of the South, yoga existed wherever there was a sizable number of people. So it's in the big cities.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. It's in Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles.
So what do these dots, some larger than others, some smaller, what do these dots represent on this map?
So the bigger the dot, the larger the number of classes in that particular city.
Okay.
So if you see a smaller dot, it means maybe there were a few classes taught there. When you see a thicker, larger dot, that means probably hundreds and hundreds of classes were taught in that city.
Yeah, so it's really heavy on the West Coast, up and down California and the Pacific Northwest, and then a little bit in the Southwest, and then over into the Northeast and the East Coast predominantly, right?
What I thought was most surprising was you also have this strong presence of yoga throughout the Midwest and the Great Lakes regions and in Utah. And this is something I think quite surprising for many people, is that if you were someone curious about yoga in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and you lived in San Antonio, Texas, if you lived in Oklahoma City, if you lived in Salt Lake City, Utah, you had an embarrassment of riches. When you break it down, you could be living in any of those cities, and over the course of 5 years, you could have as many as 10 or 12 different yoga teachers pass through your city. And in many cases, you would have the same teachers who would come back every 6 months or once a year. And in some cases, you actually had to make a decision, because it was not uncommon for there to be more than one yoga teacher teaching in the same city on the same night. We see this in San Diego and Salt Lake City, Utah, in Texas, in Cleveland, and Cincinnati. In some cases, it's almost comical. You have competing yoga teachers teaching on opposite ends of the same city block. In New York City, you often have one teaching one floor above another yoga teacher. So
Hmm.
it was a very full and vibrant world.
And you notice this noticeable gap here, really in the South, and those are for some of the reasons that you just mentioned. Due to issues of racism in the South and the uncertainty over South Asian folks at that time.
Yeah, one of the
Anything
things.
else you want to say about the sort of this gap here in the South at this time?
Well, one of the things that I'm looking at now, more and more, are the times when yoga teachers were arrested. So it was more common than I would have thought for yoga teachers to be arrested on kind of trumped up charges. There were these kind of general charges of vagrancy that were sometimes used against yoga teachers. There were also laws against unlicensed salesmen that were used against yoga teachers, and laws against spiritualists and fortune tellers. I wrote about one case where Bhagat Singh Thind was arrested in Nebraska, and he went to jail. But this happened in many other places, and it happened in the South. And because it was a network, I don't think it took very long for word to spread among these yoga teachers that maybe you don't want to teach in Florida. Maybe you want to avoid this particular city, because if you do so, you possibly risk arrest or being put into jail.
All right, and then we have a second map here. What does this map show?
So this second map is from the 1930 US Census, and it shows population density in the United States. And I think what's fascinating, when you put these two maps together, you realize that yoga is being taught basically wherever there's a sizable number of people. They are going where people are, maybe not in direct proportion, but they really are just going wherever there's an audience. Again, with that big exception of the South, where you see huge population centers in Georgia and Alabama and Tennessee without any real corresponding presence of yoga being taught.
So, today it sort of goes without saying that yoga is primarily associated with asana and physical postures. When someone thinks of yoga, they think of, a sequence of bodily stretching. Um, we know that historically this was not necessarily always the case in pre-modern India. In earlier Indian yoga traditions, asana may have played a role, but arguably it was never the primary element of yoga. This is part of Singleton's argument in Yoga Body. And Singleton seeks to address why some of the early formulations and teachings of yoga in the late 19th and early 20th century were sort of absent of asana. What does your research reveal in this regard? You'd kind of touched on earlier the flexibility of yoga during this time, the difficulty to pinpoint what yoga is and is not. But how did physical postures play a role? Was that a defining feature of yoga at this time, or where do you see that kind of coming more into prominence?
I think the real tipping point is right around the time of the Second World War. So if people who study yoga are familiar with the idea that there is a hatha yoga renaissance in India at the turn of the century. There's a handful of key reformers who take pre-existing postures in yogic practice and they combine them with other forms of physical practice, and yoga is presented in a way that is kind of systematized, it's scientific, it's hygienic, and this starts coming over to the United States really in the late 1930s. We have a few people like Rishi Singh Gurwal and Devaram Sakul there's clear record that they are reading the works of Swami Kulvalyananda. They're reading Yoga Mimamsa. But in the late 1930s, postural practice really starts coming over. You see a lot of bodybuilding and physical culture magazines starting to announce the arrival of yoga as postural practice, as something new. You have this, in this turning point, you have a lot of teachers who are already teaching in the United States and weren't including postural practice, who then, after the late 1930s, start to include it and present it as yoga. And there's really kind of no turning back. And I think it's, there's several factors there. I think yoga as a physical practice makes sense to an American audience in a way that these early mental and magical forms don't. I also think that after a decade and a half of mental and magical yoga, a lot of that got stale. A lot of that was so roundly critiqued and mocked in popular culture that this kind of more scientific, health-based, pragmatic, practical, physical presentation of yoga makes more sense. And then it simply just wins the day. These teachers who were around in the 20s and 30s, many of them are still teaching into the 1950s and early 1960s. Some of them, I kind of stunned and horrified. Some of them are literally teaching in the same venues and giving the same lectures for 20 or 30 years. In popular culture, yogis that were once seen as kind of threatening and dangerous, they kind of become domesticated and tame. You had these really strong anti-yoga polemics in newspapers and magazines saying yoga is dangerous, it's a threat, it's scary. And literally by the 1950s, you have TV episodes of Ozzie and Harriet and Lassie, where the two of them dress up like swamis for different fairs. And I think the style of teaching changes. And like after the 1940s, you start to have a different kind of yoga teacher who is more connected to a lineage. We have Indra Devi, we have Yogi Gupta, and they are more rooted into particular places instead of traveling around. And yoga starts to be promoted to Americans through mass media and through technology. And I think it really marks a turning point for which there's no turning back.
So I wanted to ask you about this book that I've got here. This book
Yes.
I picked up in my early days, before I, went to grad school and when I was a yoga practitioner. And it was really one of the first yoga books I think I found at a used bookstore up in Humboldt. And it's called The Hindu Yogi Science of Breath by Yogi Ramacharaka. This book was very impactful on me. It was the first time I had really seen some, kind of clear descriptions of some of these ideas of prana and pranayama and nostril breathing and some of these things. At the time, and for many years, I assumed Yogi Ramacharaka was one of these swamis, was a South Asian, was an Indian yoga teacher who was presenting these teachings in English for the first time.
And then you learned that Yogi Ramacharaka was
William Walker Atkinson.
Yeah, there he is.
So a lot of these figures that we've been talking about so far were South Asian and coming to the United States and, in various contexts, becoming yoga teachers, becoming these sort of traveling swamis. But there's also, a simultaneous, perhaps, or you tell me, but the rising phenomena of Western, of American seekers, or those who themselves become yoga teachers and self-styled yogis or swamis, for lack of a better term. You have William Walker Atkinson, but there's many other examples, right? And very kind of serious and earnest ones. Well, we can debate that perhaps, but Theos Bernard, Woodruff, Sir John Woodruff, also known as Arthur Avalon,
Mhm.
Um, we have these references from the transcendentalists, perhaps going back to Henry David Thoreau in the mid 1800s, being influenced by the Gita and self-identifying as a yogi.
Mhm.
So the ways in which, let's say, these teachings are now starting to really make their impact on US soil and
Mhm.
then being internalized, and that then new generations, of Westerners perhaps becoming yoga teachers themselves
Mhm.
for the first time. Maybe you can say a little bit about that, or we can talk about William Walker Atkinson in
Mhm.
particular as an example here.
Mhm.
What's going on there? you know, because yeah, for someone like me, yeah, he is putting on the guise, let's say, of an Indian guru and
Mhm.
author, and how was that quite common practice at this time?
Yeah, I think any any mention of William Walker Atkinson as Yogi Ramacharka, I think for me it brings up the big point, which is ideas of not just authenticity and lineage, but also ideas of the West and the East and where one begins and one ends. Um, it's so much more complicated than we really give credit to. In Buddhist studies, there's this, and with the study of Hinduism and yoga, there are all these like really common metaphors to use to describe the global spread of ideas. It's either birds or plants. Swans come to the lake. Eastern seeds, Western soil. It's something is transplanted and it takes root. It's really so much more complicated than that. One of the things that I was struck by in going through all of the archival evidence of the teaching of yoga in the United States is there's one figure that we don't see. We don't see any translators. None of these yoga teachers from India in the United States, up until the 20s and 30s and 40s, none of them have a translator with them. And that means that all of these people who come over from India, they already speak English. And most of them have university educations from missionary colleges, or they have older relatives who are employed as judges or bureaucrats by the British Raj. Kathy Albanese, historian of American religion, when she was talking about Sri Yogendra, she made the point that he was already well westernized before he ever came to the West. And I think it's a lot more complicated than we give credit for. There are many Americans who are making trips to India and studying with teachers. There are a lot more connections than we realize, and there's a lot more complicated middle ground. We have a lot of transnational publics and groups like the Theosophical Society, like the New Thought movement, like the Rosicrucians, that have, like the Freemasons, that have chapters and branches throughout the world where there's an enormous traffic of people and literature and ideas. One of the things that's often forgotten about, excuse me one second, one of the things that's often forgotten about our man Swami Vivekananda is that when he arrives in Chicago, he doesn't just arrive as this emissary from the East. He arrives as a Freemason. He is part of a Freemasonic lodge in India. He comes with a letter of introduction from a prominent Freemason in the United States. So things are they're more complicated and nuanced than we'd like to give credit for. And I think that's one of the distinctive features of the history of modern yoga, is that it is so transnational and it's so complicated and interwoven. And that if we try to think of it as something simple here or there, East or West, India or America, we're going to lose every time because it's so much more complicated than we give it credit for. And kind of in line with giving credit for things, I mean, the story of William Walker Atkinson, on its face, it sounds ridiculous. Here's an American lawyer who writes under this Indian pseudonym. He's never been to India. And I've seen a few academics kind of make that point as if it's something definitive. He was never even in India. In light of how transnational yoga and all of these other things are, so what? Atkinson writes books on yoga that are mostly informed through theosophy, new thought, physical culture, and self-help. And he weaves them together in books like The Hindu Yogi Science of Breath and Hatha Yoga. And he includes physical exercises as well as context and philosophy and encouragement of his students. And his books are wildly successful. Within months of their first publication, they're written about in India. They're sold in Lahore and Mumbai and Delhi and elsewhere in the early 1900s. They spread throughout the world in many ways on the coattails of other movements like Theosophy and New Thought. And his writings influence the teaching of yoga in Russia, Reiki in Japan, various movements throughout South America, Mexico, in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe. And we can kind of turn our noses up on how it's inauthentic or ill-informed, but the reality is it has a tremendous influence throughout the world. And I think that kind of like all early forms of modern yoga, it may not be exactly what we would expect, but it sets the stage. It creates the kind of momentum that allows for the massive rise of yoga in the 60s and beyond. One of the things that I just picked up, trying to justify my eBay purchases, William Walker Atkinson's writings, they show up in, of all places, Mexican comic book from the early 1970s. You have this heroic Hatha yogi fighting the smog in urban Mexico. And although the name is different, the figure and the exercises that this yogi does, they're taken directly from the Hindu yogi science of breath. So inauthentic or not, never set foot in India or not, you kind of can't deny the history and the influence.
So looking broadly at this, massive body of data that you've amassed of yoga and yoga teaching during this period, if we were to look at, yoga today as it's taught and practiced and presented online, and how yoga is, just expressed today, what would you say are just kind of bullet points? What are some of the major differences and similarities to early American yoga and the yoga today? Let's say in the United States.
I would say some of the main differences are what's practiced. The physical postural practice that we understand as yoga today wasn't really around in any significant way in the 1920s or 1930s. People had very different ideas of what yoga was or how someone did yoga. Yoga was also much more marginal in the 1920s and 30s. It wasn't as accepted. It wasn't mainstream. It was frequently critiqued. That's not to say that yoga today doesn't have critiques from all over, but it certainly is not demonized in a broad sense in the way that it was in the 1920s or 30s. But there are still plenty of similarities. And I think it says a lot. In some ways, it's very shocking to realize that some of the expectations and the hopes and the naive assumptions of spiritual seekers in America in the 1920s, they still exist 100 years later. People come to yoga today for many of the same reasons that they did 100 years earlier, for wellness, for well-being, for healing, for kind of philosophical searching. And I think one of the perhaps cautionary tales that we can take from the early history of yoga is that so many people 100 years ago could so easily craft their personas, and they could so easily appeal to spiritual seekers and make up lineages or make up claims that were not verifiable. And I think we see a lot of those things that are going on today. I don't think we need to look much further than a teacher like Yogi Bhajan, who is not only doing what many of these yoga teachers did in the 20s and 30s, but he was actually pulling kind of very directly from some of them as well.
Mm. All right, as we start to kind of wrap things up here, let's look ahead a little bit to your upcoming course, YS 102, Modern Yoga in the West. This course is actually a 2.0. This is a revised version of the course that you delivered back in 2019, and we're really excited to have you present it again. Perhaps fill in, some gaps, update, some of your findings as your dissertation research and writing has continued. This course is going to run live from November 18th through December 16th, 2022. So please join us live. But if you're watching this at a later date, then all the recordings are available. Give us a little preview, Philip, of what students can expect in this course. Tell us a little bit about the 4 modules that you have planned for us.
So the main goal that I have in YS 102 is to give students a familiarity with how yoga came to be what it is today. The last 150 years, how did yoga change and how did we get to where we are? And I see it as both something that is self-contained. It'll give you a great overview of that, ideas on how to think about the rise of modern yoga in the West, but also a good introduction and starting off point for people who want to delve further into that history, to give them a toolkit and a set of ideas that they can take with them to explore even further on their own. So it's broken down into 4 modules. In the first module, we're really going to kind of get into that toolkit. We're going to talk about ideas and how complicated some ideas are. We're going to try to understand how is modern yoga different than pre-modern yoga? How do people understand ideas of the West and the East? What are some of the problems and complications with that? And then we're going to go through a series of ideas that I think are very helpful for people to start critically thinking about the history of modern yoga. Ideas of Orientalism and colonialism and reinculturation, or the pizza effect from Agyananda Bharati. We're going to talk about the spectrum that exists between religion and spirituality and secular wellness. And we're also going to have some fun case studies and examples to really get ourselves thinking about how complicated and nuanced modern yoga is in some ways that we might have to approach it. The second and third modules are kind of broken in half. So in module 2, we're going to look at the early history of modern yoga in the West, before the Hatha Renaissance really takes hold. And so we're going to look at these mental and magical forms of yoga. We're going to look at not only the Swami Circuit in the United States, but we're going to look at how early ideas of yoga were spreading throughout the world, in Britain, in Europe, in Japan, in Russia, and Latin America. And again, we're going to delve deep into the history of William Walker Atkinson as Yogi Ramacharaka to really chart that growth and that movement and see some of the particular features of that early history. In module 3, we're going to look at what happens when the Hatha Renaissance really takes hold. We're going to go from the Second World War up to the present day. We're going to focus on some key teachers and reformers and key periods of time. We're going to see how ideas of yoga as physical and postural move from the 1950s through the hippie counterculture of the 60s and 70s, how it moves through the New Age movement and the kind of mainstream acceptance of alternative medicine. We're also going to look at how yoga fits into the boom in secular fitness movements from the 1980s and beyond. One of the things that we're going to pay attention to is not only key reformers, but how certain forms of media and technology helped facilitate the growth and rise of modern yoga in the West. So we're going to look at pulp paperback books. We're going to look at television. We're going to look at the internet and social media, at photography. And module 3 is going to end with a kind of a close look at where yoga is today. We're going to look at some studies and some surveys so that we can really get a kind of fact data-based understanding of what yoga looks like today in the contemporary world. And with that set up, in module 4, we're going to kind of plant our feet in the present and look to the future. And we're going to ask a lot of questions of ourselves, of knowing what we know through the first 3 modules of how modern yoga came to be in the West. What will the future be like? What are some questions? What are some potentials? What are some problems? What are some potential concerns in the future as yoga continues? We're going to look at ideas of the guru's student model, ideas of cultural appropriation and the political power of yoga, ideas of consumerism and capitalism and the economics of yoga. We are also going to take a close look at Yogi Bhajan and the late Yogi Bhajan and his form of Kundalini yoga. And we're going to see that as kind of a case study where we can bring together a lot of the themes and ideas that we've worked on for the previous 3 modules and see perhaps the consequences and the perils of some aspects of modern yoga and how they play out.
Fantastic. So for anybody, interested in how yoga came to be what it is today in this early history, this is really essential knowledge that Philip's going to be sharing, and I highly, highly recommend that you join us for this course. Philip, before I let you go here, I have to ask, tell us a little bit about this image here that we're using for the header of this course. What's going on in this image, and who is the figure at the center here?
So this is Super Akasha Yogi Wasan. This was a photograph taken of one of his private courses of instruction in Texas, I believe in 1924. And I love the image so much. So you get this really clear view of what it would have been like to take a yoga workshop about 100 years ago. Yogi Wasan is looking incredibly earnest, as are many of his students. He's surrounded by various charts and graphs that he created. And one of my favorite touches is you see all of these robes that his students are wearing. Like a good entrepreneur, Yogi Wasan told his students that he had these robes of 7 colors, kind of invoking the Bible, but also his own kind of mystical claims. And so he told his students that if they wore these robes, they would be connected to him. And that's why they're all wearing these robes. And I'm sure his wife at the time, she was a seamstress who was putting them together. And I'm sure it was like an added bonus to sell for the class. So I love this picture for so many reasons, because in some ways it's absurd, it's comical, but it's also showing how earnest so many of these students are. And it really captures how eclectic and different yoga was thought of during this time.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, Philip. Well, thank you so much for your time today and sharing this fascinating research with us. Thanks for offering to teach this upcoming course. It's always a pleasure to get to connect with you, about the research process and just so many fascinating stories and characters. All of these figures, before I encountered your work, most of them I had never heard of. These are figures that have really been forgotten in the history of yoga. And they tell so much, though, about, what yoga was and, what has gone into making yoga the global phenomenon, that it is today. So kudos to you and your research, and good luck with the writing and finishing up the dissertation. We're in a similar boat there, and we really look forward to your course.
Thank you. Happy to
So
be teaching again.
So thanks everyone for listening and tuning in. Please, subscribe, leave us a positive rating if you like. If you're on YouTube, feel free to leave a comment or a question. We'd be happy to respond to it. And with that, I think that's it for now. So please take care, everyone. And thanks again to Philip.